Hey, so good to see you again. Welcome back to this week's episode of Closed by Mo. My name is Mohammed. You can call me Mo. I'm hopefully your favorite host on YouTube on most things real estate. I'm also a commercial real estate broker and an investor. And in this week's episode, we're going to shift gears and talk a little bit more about the commercial leasing side of things, because I had a very sort of unfortunate conversation a couple of weeks ago with a client of mine that had signed a lease with another broker a few years ago in a commercial space, and now they were officially going out of business, so they needed advice on how to get out of their lease altogether. Now, in this video, I'm not going to show you exactly how to get out of a commercial lease, because commercial leases vary from situation to situation based on what the landlord and the tenant have agreed upon, but I can give you a little bit of advice on how to handle a situation when you have a commercial lease in place and as a tenant you have officially going out of business or are about to be going out of business. So without further ado, let's jump right into a couple of things to keep in mind when you're experiencing a business failure and you need to get out of your commercial lease. Now, to begin this video, I like to tell all my commercial clients, all my commercial tenants, especially the tenants that I'm representing, always try and maintain a good relationship with your commercial landlord, because the commercial real estate world is very small. Especially if you're in a big city, it might seem like you have a lot of different options out there, but commercial landlords are always going to be talking to each other, and depending on whether or not you move into another space, or your business fails and you start a new business and you need to provide a reference to another commercial space, all these landlords know each other or are probably talking to each other, and they may require a reference from your previous landlord to approve you on a new commercial lease. So I always advise my clients, especially my tenant clients, to always maintain a good relationship with their landlord. The reason I bring that up is because the very first thing you should keep in mind, if you're in an unfortunate position where your business is going out of business, is notification of closure. So you have to provide to your landlord, most preferably in writing, especially in a certified mail, that hey, my business is going out of business and I now have to terminate my obligations in the lease itself. Now, of course, a lot of these things that I'm about to say depend on how the lease is actually structured. So take this with a little bit of a grain of salt. This video is going to be very general, but I hope it at least imparts a little bit of wisdom, a little bit of knowledge on what you can and can't do. Now, what you should do after you've notified your landlord that you're going out of business is you have to sit down and go through the lease agreement together. Most of the time, if the broker that you've worked with has a little bit of idea of what they're doing, and the market is the way it is, or the market hasn't shifted too much, you may have a clause in the actual commercial lease to help you get out of that. I'm not saying you're going to get out of it completely scot-free. What I'm referring to is what we call an early termination clause. Now, an early termination clause is very vague in a sense. That's why you leave it up to the contract terms to figure out how you want to set it up. What I mean by this is, let's say, God forbid, you go out of business and you can't meet your lease obligations anymore. The early termination clause might specify that depending on how many more lease terms or how many more months or years you have left on the lease, that the landlord gets some kind of recuperation because you've gone out of business and you're not going to be able to pay the full amount of the remaining term of the lease. So in this case, let's say you have 5 more years left of a commercial lease and you go out of business. Those 5-year payments might add up to be like $150,000 to the landlord. The early termination clause might be set up in a way where you say, okay, I've gone out of business. I will pay 5% or 10% or however much amount percentage of the total remaining balance of that lease. I'm not saying it's going to be a percentage. It might even be a few months up front. It might even be that you forego your security deposit, but it is one of the things to keep in mind. It's what we call an early termination clause. A couple of other things that will definitely come up when you have a conversation with your landlord is mitigation of damages. Right? There's usually like a clause in there that will protect the landlord in case the tenant defaults. That means it might be a couple of different things besides just the early termination clause where you as the tenant have to pay the landlord. Mitigation of damages might entail that you as the tenant are responsible for finding another tenant to occupy that space, or even assign that lease to that new tenant with the landlord's approval. So this way that the landlord has less of an uninterrupted flow of their overall lease payments, because you have to keep in mind the landlord may have very well taken that lease once you signed it to the bank and financed the property, because they financed their property based off of the lease terms on their actual commercial property. So now if you were going out of business and you have like a mitigation of damages clause in the commercial lease, that means it's on you as the tenant to find another tenant for the landlord, and you may actually even be responsible for any of the broker fees that might be involved with that entire transaction, because I'm sure that once you initially signed that commercial lease in the beginning of your period, that the landlord paid most of the broker's landlord's fees, or at least in New York, that's how it's done. A couple other things as well that are related, obviously, subleasing or assigning the lease. Depending on whether or not the landlord will approve, and at least the landlord has some say in the entire process of assigning the lease, you might be able to work out a situation where, let's say, you pay a certain portion of it for the early termination clause, but you're also finding another tenant for the landlord, another suitable tenant for the landlord, that can, occupy the space and take over your lease. That way it's completely uninterrupted for the landlord. So a bit of advice: if you know you have a certain amount of runway before you run out of business and you have to officially close shop, know that beforehand, because at least give yourself and the landlord some time to find another tenant. And this is where communication is the most important thing, because not you or your landlord want to be caught blindsided with missed payments, right? Especially, which sort of leads me to my next thing, which is the security deposit and unpaid rent. If you've gone out of business in January and you officially find someone else to take over the space by June, July, that's several months in rent that hasn't been paid to the landlord, right? So what the landlord may do, or probably will do, is they will use your security deposit to cover those missed payments, leaving you as the tenant not getting any of your security deposit back, which is just like the norm here. If you pay a bunch of security deposit up front to secure a space, if the landlord decides that, hey, you're defaulting on your lease, they can chip away at your security deposit and effectively not give you anything back, even if you leave the premises in the exact same condition that you found it in, because technically those are damages of unpaid rent. A few other things to keep in mind, especially if you're a new business that has signed a new commercial lease. 9 times out of 10, what I'm seeing is what we call a good guy guarantee, or a personal guarantee in New York City, New York State. Basically, you as the business owner, your personal information, your social security, and everything is provided to guarantee that commercial lease, because remember, you still have a very new business, so the landlord might not completely trust that the business is going to do well for as long as you would like to be around. But this way, by having a personal guarantee in the lease, it incentivizes the landlord to give you the space in the first place. But in this case, it might come back to hurt you, because if you're going out of business and you can't fulfill your lease obligations, the landlord is legally able to go after you. That's the whole point of a personal guarantee. It shows that you have skin in the game, whether that's in the good times or whether that's in the bad times, unfortunately. The key takeaway here is, I would say the main point that I'm trying to make is always keep communications open with your landlord. I've never had a situation where a landlord is, not willing to work things through with a commercial tenant, because, hey, we know, this is life, things happen, especially when you're in that small to medium business space, because most small businesses or startups will fail within the first 2 to 5 years. It's the name of the game, right? I think it's more than 50% of businesses will fail in the first couple of years. So if you're a brand new business and you've signed a long-term commercial lease, the landlord isn't necessarily expecting it to fail, but the landlord shouldn't be surprised when you as the tenant are unable to meet the lease obligations because your business has failed. So this is why I always say keep communications open with your landlord, because when you need to, you can go and negotiate with them, renegotiate with them, or even if that fails, maybe you guys can go to arbitration or mediation to find a solution that works for everyone, where everyone will compromise a little bit. So with that, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'll catch you guys next week.